Chapter 12 Half Marathon in Lapland by Wim Hof. For a small portion of my life, I worked as a postman. It was my job to drive boxes, letters, parcels, and advertisements to post offices so that they could then be delivered to their specific locations. I worked alone during the nights. The solitude gave me time to reflect on past events and encouraged deeper thinking. One day, while I was driving down the road, I received a phone call from a Canadian producer representing the Discovery Channel. He asked if I was interested in doing a challenge in the cold. I listened very attentively as he explained his proposition. I held back my excitement and calmly told the gentleman, yes, I'd love to. He told me he would send me an email soon and that I should reply at my convenience. I ended the call and continued my work as a postman. I was thrilled. The excitement lasted all day. As soon as I got home, I turned on my computer and checked my email. The message was already sitting in my inbox. It explained that the challenge would be the center of attention for a documentary. The event would take place just beyond the polar circle. At that time, it was November, and the challenge was set to take place in January. The only thing we had left to figure out was the type of challenge that I would pursue. I had already swam under ice and ran a half marathon on the slopes of Everest. However, my run was only filmed by Dutch television and wasn't internationally broadcasted. So, I sent an email back to the producer and explained that I could run a barefooted half marathon beyond the polar circle. It fit their expectations perfectly. Weeks went by, and December came, and I hadn't done any training whatsoever. As the date of the challenge approached, I became really tense, as I normally do. It's a natural reaction that occurs when the mind worries. To ease my mind, I decided it was time to start my training with a run. Since it was my first run in a long time, I only ran 1.5 kilometers, which is about 0.93 miles. It was just a quick jog around the neighborhood where I lived. The following day, I went for a 7 kilometer, which is a 4.3 mile run. I felt a little sore afterward, so I didn't run for the next 2 days. Instead, I went for a cold water swim to relax and regain my energy. The third time I ran barefooted next to a lake. I ran back and forth on a wooden boardwalk along the shore. It was cold and windy that day, so no one was around when I did my run. It was nice to be able to run in peace. I didn't stop my run until blisters developed on the bottom of my feet, and by that point, I'd run a total of 22 kilometers, which is 13.6 miles. Over the next week, I simply continued my work as a postman. I would tend to my blisters from time to time and take care of them so that they would heal properly. It was a week of rejuvenation. After I healed, I returned to the place on the shore to run. Once again, it was cold and windy, and the solitude was nice. I ran 24 kilometers, which is 14.9 miles, barefooted, and developed at least 20 new blisters. When I returned home, I was more than satisfied with my run and knew that in time my feet would heal. Later that evening, my daughter stopped by my house and asked if I wanted to run a few laps with her around the park. I agreed, and while we were running, I told her all about my new challenge. My legs were feeling great, and after 2 laps, 8 kilometers, 4.9 miles, I felt the urge to run even faster. When we finished, the run had made me so happy that I was extremely confident that the challenge would be a success. I was so overjoyed that I cried. Challenges bring about the true nature within me. It alerts my body and my mind, altering my state of being. It makes me feel so alive. It's like I always say, we can do more than what we think. At those moments, when I encounter a challenge, I become extremely aware of the deeper layers of my soul. Since the challenge was quickly approaching, the camera team traveled to Amsterdam to take a few video shots of where I lived and record the activities that I do on a daily basis. There, we did an interview and took a few shots in a local abattoir, which is a slaughterhouse. Afterward, the camera crew departed for Lapland, Finland, where I would be joining them 2 days later. Lapland can be a very, very cold place in the winter. The temperature can drop as low as negative 50 degrees Celsius, which is negative 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Even weak polar animals may die in temperatures this cold. It is really a survival of the fittest. 2 days after the crew visited my home, I had to meet them in Helsinki. We then took a flight to Oulu, about 800 kilometers north, 497 miles. It was negative 20 degrees Celsius, negative 4 degrees Fahrenheit outside when our flight landed. While we were waiting for our ride to pick us up, I decided to take off my shoes and try running a kilometer in the snow. It felt great. The snow was in perfect condition for running. My little test made me even more confident for the challenge. The next day, we went to the Finnish Institute of Occupational Health for a cold water experiment. The experiment consisted of me sitting in a cold water basin, which was set up inside of the laboratory. Professor Oksa, a world-renowned cold physiologist, was the man who performed the examination of my body. Oksa had a passion for the outdoors. Though it was not as extreme as mine, it was a pleasure to meet him, and our discussions were rich and fulfilling. Before we even started the experiment, Oksa first carried out a few baseline tests to get a general reading. He saw that I had a very small percentage of substance fat. He explained that it was an interesting discovery because without much fat, I don't have a lot of protection from the cold. He announced that he was excited to see how I would react when exposed to the cold water basin. To prepare for the experiment, the professor connected my body to many different machines. First, he connected me to an echocardiogram. He then gave me a pill to swallow, which would monitor my core body temperature. He also connected a blood pressure cuff to my arm and gave me a mask to measure the acidification of my exhaled breaths. When the cold begins to impact the body, the extremities receive less oxygen and acidification begins. The more conditioned the body is to the cold, the less the body will be affected. The vital organs need to have the body operating at 37 degrees Celsius, which is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, in order to function properly. If the temperature drops even a couple degrees below this, the body will begin to shiver and the blood will shunt from the extremities. That's when the core temperature really begins to be affected. The core temperature of the body shouldn't drop below 35 degrees Celsius, which is 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Otherwise, the body will be more likely to suffer from hypothermia, which can damage the liver, lungs, heart, and brain. When cold flows through vital organs, the body slowly becomes dysfunctional. The heart beats irregularly, thinking processes and reflexes are slowed down, and breathing becomes more difficult. When the blood temperature drops to about 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, the body begins to shut down. During this time, the vital organs could begin to fail. The heart could stop beating, and one would have the potential of falling into a coma. Ultimately, these final consequences could lead to death. The specialists who research the cold say that sometimes people can appear dead when they are pulled out of the water, while they're really in a comatose state. Sadly, sometimes people will attempt to warm up hypothermic victims too quickly, and this alone can cause the person to go into shock and die. We moved the experimentation process to the basin. I was seated on a motorized chair, which was controlled by a remote control in the hands of Professor Oksa. There, I would be lowered down into 8 degrees Celsius, 46.4 degree Fahrenheit water. When we finished up the connections, Dr. Oksa reviewed the monitors one last time, and we were ready to go. He began lowering me into the water, and the immersion began. Dr. Oksa's first reaction was surprise. He was astonished that I had no gasping reflex when I first entered the water. It meant that the veins around my core had immediately closed and that they were conditioned very well. My adaptation to the cold was excellent. Minutes passed and my core temperature stayed the same. After 10 minutes, Oksa noticed that my core temperature actually rose. He thought this was a remarkable change in my body. The powerful thing about the experience was that everything felt under control. I felt great. My attention was positioned toward a point on the wall in front of me. It helped me stay focused in my mind so that I could stay warm. As a result, my core temperature remained stable despite the freezing cold water. Since I was feeling comfortable, I decided to enjoy it. I began asking the professor questions about his life and his hobbies. Later on, I realized that this caused me to lose my focus, which is what had been maintaining my core temperature. After 25 minutes, my core temperature had fallen zero point 0.5 degrees Celsius, zero point 0.9 degrees Fahrenheit, and Dr. Oksa decided to end the experiment. It was stupid of me to lose focus like that, but I now know that it's important to always pay attention and remain centered. Cold water can be merciless, and if you aren't paying attention, you can quickly lose control of the situation. Therefore, always remain focused and attentive. After the experiment, the crew stayed to interview the professor. He stated his findings and said that he believed that I'd be able to successfully complete the half marathon due to my extraordinary control that I had demonstrated in the cold water experiment. After we completed our mission in Oulu at the Institute, we went back to the hotel and I enjoyed a nice, warm sauna. The next day, we left for Kalari, where I would run the barefooted half marathon. The temperature had dropped to negative 30 degrees Celsius, negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. When we arrived, we stayed in a wooden lodge where we did a few shots of the arrival for the documentary. There were only 2 days left until the run, so we prepared the itinerary and scheduled the sleds that would carry the film crew. Before we knew it, the day to run was upon us. Everything was set and ready to go. Both local and national journalists were present for the event. As everyone was preparing for the event to begin, I noticed the starting line was covered with reindeer skin. It appeared as if it was some sort of primordial spot, as if the skin was placed there in an attempt to bring back the prehistoric men. I stood at the starting line and gazed out into the horizon. It was time. I took a deep breath, let out an excited yell, and took off. While running over the snow and ice barefooted and in such frigid temperatures, I honestly didn't know how it would end. My expectations were that I would complete the event with no problem, but I stayed very alert. I stayed in a place where I had heightened awareness. As I knocked away kilometer after kilometer, Everything felt fine. Physiologically speaking, I was in control. After 10 kilometers, 6.2 miles, I checked myself over in my head. My mind was strong, limbs felt great, and my core was warm. There was nothing to be concerned about, so I just continued on. I even made jokes while I was jogging, sometimes speaking to the camera crew as they were recording me from the sled. I did this with caution though, so I could make the experience different from the laboratory and remain in control. When you exert energy through talking, it's like opening a door and letting the cold air into a house. If you hold the door open for too long, the house will lose all of its heat. I made sure I didn't leave that door open for too long so that I could remain focused on my body and succeed. While I continued on, the chemistry in my body was working just fine. I had no problems whatsoever. The journalists were confident that I was going to make it. That's when something began to change. I just began to feel difficulties in the front part of my left foot. I didn't know what was going on, but I could sense that something was wrong. It continued to get worse and worse until my whole foot resembled that of a wooden stick. I couldn't feel it anymore. This was all happening right as I was passing the 18-kilometer mark, 11.1 miles. There were only 3 more kilometers to go, 1.8 miles. I decided to just do it. Step after step, breath after breath, I made my way forward, and eventually, I saw the finish line. It was another spot that was covered with reindeer skin, just like the beginning. I'm gonna make it, I thought. The last 200 meters of my run were beautiful. As I came closer, the sun broke through the trees and lit up the sky. It was a magical coincidence. While nearing the finish line, I gazed up at the sun. My gold medal hung in the air before me. At the time, I didn't know what kind of sacrifice I was making to finish the race, but it opened a door to a devastating problem, a problem that would take me weeks to recover from. So after the race, we went directly to the local hospital. The dermatologist there told me that I had third-degree frostbite. I showed my foot to the cameras so that everyone could see what I put my body through to complete that race. And then I returned to Holland on crutches.